Welcome back to the war trench.
Why Germany's jet engines melted themselves to death in the spring of 1944, a German pilot climbed into the cockpit of the fastest aircraft on Earth, the Messerschmitt Me 262. 100 miles an hour faster than anything the Allies could put in the sky. A weapon that should have ended Germany's air war in its favor. He started the engines and began counting. Not minutes until takeoff, minutes until the engine destroyed itself. Because somewhere inside those twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojets, at temperatures north of 800 degrees Celsius, a set of metal blades spinning at over 9,000 revolutions per minute were already dying. Not from enemy fire, not from pilot error, from their own engine's exhaust. Germany had built the world's first operational jet fighter. And then they built it out of the wrong metal, because the right metal was 8,000 kilometers away, sitting in the ground in places like Zimbabwe and the Philippines, in territory the German war machine would never touch again. This is the story of how a war was lost in a furnace, how an engine that should have run for hundreds of hours was given an official lifespan of 25, and how the most advanced propulsion technology of the 20th century was undone not by Spitfires or Mustangs, but by the periodic table. Most people who know the Me 262 story know the legend. Fastest fighter of World War II. 4 30mm cannons. Could have turned the tide if Hitler hadn't insisted on using it as a bomber. That story is true, but it's the easy version. It's the version that blames a man's bad decision instead of a problem no decision could have fixed. Here's the real bottleneck, and it has nothing to do with tactics. A jet engine works by compressing air, igniting it with fuel, and blasting the resulting superheated gas backward through a turbine to generate thrust. That turbine, specifically its blades, sits directly in the exhaust path of combustion. In the Jumo 04, gas temperatures hitting the turbine inlet reached around 700 to 800 degrees Celsius. Some estimates push higher, depending on throttle setting. Now here's the part engineers in 1944 understood perfectly, and that audiences today almost never hear explained. Metal doesn't just melt at high temperature. It creeps. Creep is slow. Permanent deformation under sustained stress at high heat, even stress far below what would normally bend or break the metal at room temperature. A turbine blade spinning at 9,000 RPM is under enormous centrifugal load, and if that load is sustained for too long at too high a temperature, the metal's internal crystal structure starts to stretch, slip, and elongate. The blade doesn't shatter dramatically. It quietly grows longer until it's grinding against the engine casing or until it simply lets go. To resist creep, you need an alloy with specific ingredients. Chromium for oxidation resistance, it forms a protective skin that stops the metal from burning away in superheated air. Nickel for structural stability at temperature, keeping the crystal lattice from collapsing under stress. And often, cobalt, molybdenum, or tungsten to reinforce the matrix further. This family of materials would eventually get a name, superalloys. Britain and the United States were developing them too. Mnemonic alloys in the UK used roughly 80% nickel and 20% chromium, and they worked beautifully. Germany needed that same chemistry. And by 1943, Germany's access to nickel, chromium, cobalt, and tungsten had collapsed. This wasn't a design failure. It was a supply chain failure dressed up as an engineering problem, and it's the part of the Jumo 04 story that almost never gets the spotlight. Because we ran out of nickel doesn't sound as cinematic as Hitler made a bad call. But it's far more interesting. Because it's a story about geology deciding the outcome of an air war before a single rivet was placed. So before we get to the blades themselves, the hollow, oil-cooled sheet metal stamped workarounds Germany engineered out of pure desperation, we need to understand exactly what Germany had, what it lost, and when it lost it. because the timeline of Germany's metal shortage and the timeline of jet engine development are the same timeline. They were never separate stories. That's the angle nobody tells you. Let's follow the metal. Nickel. Before the war, the world's dominant nickel source was Sudbury, Ontario, Canadian, Allied-controlled, untouchable. Germany's alternative supply came primarily from Petsamo in Finland, a nickel mine Germany fought hard to keep access to through 1944. When Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union in September 1944 and turned against its former ally, that nickel line didn't just get harder to use, it closed. Chromium. Here the story gets almost absurd. Chromium for German industry came overwhelmingly from one place: Turkey. Neutral, strategically courted by both Axis and Allied diplomats throughout the war. Turkey sold chrome ore to Germany under trade agreements that the Allies spent enormous diplomatic and economic effort trying to break. In 1944, sustained Allied pressure finally succeeded. Turkey suspended chrome exports to Germany that April. Stockpiles bought Germany a few more months. By the time Me-262 production was ramping toward its peak in late 1944, that pipeline was gone. Cobalt and tungsten followed similar patterns, concentrated in colonial territories and neutral trade arrangements that Allied blockades and diplomacy steadily strangled through the war's final 2 years. So picture the timeline stacked up. Germany's jet engine program reaches operational maturity in 1944, the exact same year its 3 critical alloying elements get cut off, one by one, through military defeat, diplomatic pressure, and shifting alliances. The Jumo 004 wasn't designed by engineers who didn't understand superalloys. It was designed and redesigned again by engineers who understood superalloys perfectly and couldn't get the ingredients. This is the detail that turns the story from Germany built a flawed engine into something much sharper. Germany built 2 engines. The one on paper, full of chromium nickel steel, was sound. The one in the factory, built from substitutes, was a controlled, scheduled act of self-destruction, and German engineers knew it, documented it, and shipped it anyway, because a jet fighter with a short lifespan was still better than no jet fighter at all. So, what do you actually build when you can't build the alloy you need? German metallurgists turned to what they had: iron-based steels reinforced as best they could manage, without adequate nickel or chromium. The result was a class of substitute alloys that could survive the operating environment barely, and not for long. The turbine blades themselves needed a complete rethink. Solid steel blades without proper superalloy content would creep and fail within a handful of hours under full combustion temperature. So engineers at Junkers turned the blade itself into the cooling solution. Instead of forging solid blades, they stamped them from sheet steel into a hollow, airfoil-shaped shell, then packed the interior with a cooling mechanism fed by the engine's lubricating oil, so the blade carried away heat from the inside rather than relying entirely on the alloy's own resistance to it. This was a genuinely creative solution to a problem nobody should have had to solve mid-war. It wasn't a downgrade chosen out of laziness. It was active cooling engineering, decades before active blade cooling became a standard feature of jet propulsion in peacetime aviation. In a strange way, the nickel shortage forced Germany into inventing a cooling concept that modern turbines still use just under conditions of total desperation rather than careful peacetime development. But cooling could only buy so much. Even with hollow, oil-fed blades, the substitute steel still crept under sustained heat and centrifugal stress. So Junkers did something almost nobody talks about. They didn't just redesign the blade. They redesigned the expectation. The Jumo 004's overhaul life, the number of flight hours before the engine needed to be torn down and rebuilt, was officially rated at around 25 hours. Some sources put practical combat life even lower, with blades requiring replacement well before that mark under sustained high-throttle operation. Compare that to engines built with proper superalloys elsewhere in the world, which were achieving service lives in the hundreds of hours. 25 hours. For context, that's roughly the flight time of a handful of combat sorties. German jet pilots weren't flying an engine with a maintenance schedule. They were flying an engine with an expiration date built into its metallurgy, known in advance, accepted as the cost of having a jet fighter at all. And the engine told you when it was failing. Pilots and ground crews reported a telltale visual signal, a fine spray of metal particles, sometimes described as glowing sparks or fragments exiting the exhaust as overheated turbine blades shed material under stress. That wasn't a malfunction in the conventional sense. That was the substitute alloy doing exactly what substitute alloys did, failing on a schedule, visibly, in real time, every single flight. Let's put hard figures next to each other, because this is where the detective story closes its case. A properly formulated nickel-chromium superalloy, the mnemonic family used in British jet engines of the same era, could sustain turbine inlet temperatures with service lives stretching past 100 hours, in some cases multiples of that. Before requiring an overhaul, the Jumo 004, built from substitute steel, was rated at roughly 25 hours. That's not a small efficiency gap. That's an order of magnitude difference in component lifespan, and it maps almost exactly onto the alloy composition gap between what German engineers wanted to use and what blockades, diplomacy, and battlefield losses actually allowed them to use. Germany produced more than 1,400 Me 262s by the end of the war. Estimates suggest only a few hundred ever saw actual combat, and engine reliability, not airframe production, was one of the central reasons why. You can build the fastest fighter in the world. If its engine is functionally a consumable part with a known countdown clock, your fastest fighter in the world is also your least available fighter in the world. This is the angle that almost never gets told. The Me 262 wasn't undermined by a single decision in a single meeting in 1943. It was undermined 2 years earlier and several thousand kilometers away, in mining concessions and diplomatic cables in Petsamo, in Ankara. In colonial cobalt and tungsten contracts the Allies systematically dismantled. The blockade didn't just starve German cities, it starved German turbines, atom by atom, of the exact elements those turbines needed to survive their own exhaust. There's a tendency, looking back at World War II air power, to talk about it entirely in terms of pilots, tactics, and the genius or stupidity of high command. The Me 262 usually gets filed under brilliant weapon, squandered by bad strategy. But the deeper truth sitting underneath the legend is this: you cannot out-engineer geology. Germany's metallurgists weren't incompetent. They invented hollow, oil-cooled turbine blades under wartime pressure, a genuinely forward-thinking solution that anticipated cooling techniques used in jet engines for decades afterward. What they couldn't invent was nickel that wasn't there, or chromium that Turkey had stopped shipping, or cobalt sitting in colonial territories an exhausted, blockaded nation could no longer reach. The Jumo 004 wasn't a flawed engine. It was a precisely engineered compromise built to fail on a known schedule, because a fighter that worked for 25 hours and then needed rebuilding was still infinitely more valuable than the fighter Germany couldn't build at all. In the end, the most advanced jet engine of the Second World War wasn't beaten by an opposing engine. It was beaten by a periodic table its country no longer controlled.